Ugandan people, if they want freedom, have got to take to the streets, just as in Iran. And once the government starts using violence against Ugandan protesters, that's the final red line. When people protest for democracy and a government uses violence, that becomes a foreign policy issue. And we're seeing that happening right now in Uganda. We saw the pictures of Barbie Kyagulanyi being manhandled in her own home. Bobby is away. He's staying away from the army. He's in hiding to protect himself in the future. And she's home alone, and the army breaks in and manhandles her. So we're seeing this type of abuse by a U.S. ally. When a U.S. ally does this and uses U.S. monies to the tune of $1 billion a year to abuse its citizens and the wife of the opposition leader, this becomes a foreign policy problem. And that's why it's so significant that Senator Risch stepped in and made this statement.
Yes, Bruce. The senator actually describes Uganda's elections as a horror exercise. I want you to take us in clear perspective, in legal and diplomatic terms. What does that phrase alone actually signal?
Well, that signals the fact that it's obvious to the world that there were no true and fair elections. Opposition parties were prevented from campaigning. Bobby Wine was prevented from campaigning almost anywhere in the country. He was followed by troops. His home was surrounded by troops the entire time. And he was given no access to the Ugandan media. And so when we call it a hollow election, it's because it's got the form and appearance of an election, but none of the reality. There was no true election campaign because the opposition was not allowed to truly campaign. And now we're seeing troops, thousands of troops just fanning out in the country there to prevent any protests. What kind of election is it if people can't protest after the fact? So this is what the senator means by a hollow election. We should also remember that the election commission in Uganda is completely under the domination of the Museveni regime, as are the courts. The courts have lost all independence in Uganda. 5 or 6 years ago, there were still independent judges. Today, they're afraid. Today, they know there are no red lines for Museveni. He'll cross that line and throw judges in prison. So it's a hollow election because we have no true campaigning. The opposition is forcibly kept from being on the streets and being with the people. We have an election commission that's a captive of Museveni. And we have a court system that long ago lost the power to act. I think that's what the senator means. We have the falsity of an election, not the reality of one.
Yeah, calling this election a horror exercise, does this undermine Museveni's legitimacy internationally, even if he controls all institutions back home? Because all institutions here are in Museveni's pocket. And we see a United States Senate calling the election a horror exercise. Does it undermine Museveni's legitimacy internationally, or it doesn't at all?
I don't think Museveni has any legitimacy internationally. I think that the events of the last few years have made it clear he's simply a dictator. He's no longer allowing any institutions to exist in his country. This is a pure authoritarian state. Uganda is now a dictatorship just like it was under Obote and Idi Amin. There's no difference. Museveni may be slightly less bloodthirsty than Idi Amin, but there's no difference in the dictatorship. Thousands have been rounded up and arrested. Thousands have been kept in prison over the last 5 years. Yeah. We have hundreds of affidavits showing torture. Museveni has no legitimacy internationally. The U.S. is still allowing his troops to be on peacekeeping missions, perhaps because there's no one else there at the moment, but there's no legitimacy for Museveni. I think Senator Risch's statement is very important. It's the beginning of a change in U.S. policy.
On the same note, the statement explicitly mentions about abductions, imprisonment, intimidation, and the political violence. And these are the same abuses Ugandans in Uganda and those in the diaspora that keep on the streets of London, streets of Washington, streets of Boston protesting. These are the same abuses they have been ailing out, and the Nayion platform has documented for years. Now, from your experience, Bruce, what threshold must be crossed for the United States moves from statements to action? Has Uganda under Museveni crossed that line, or it hasn't?
I would say Museveni is very close to the line if he hasn't crossed it. He has suppressed a free election. He has arrested thousands of people. Undoubtedly, some have been killed. We know torture is rampant. We know Muhoozi, his son, has a free hand in threatening any politician, threatening Bobi Wine's life, going after his family. These are red lines, and they're already crossed. Now, what happened in Iran is millions took to the streets and thousands were killed by the government. That's a red line. That's a point we haven't yet reached in Uganda. The Ugandan people, if they want freedom, have got to take to the streets, just as in Iran. And once the government starts using violence against Ugandan protesters, that's the final red line. So we're close to the point where the absolute line has been crossed. But what we need, and Bobi Wine has said this, people have to take to the streets and protest peacefully, but they've got to be out there and be seen. And eventually the army will overreact and use force. And that begins that downward death spiral of the Museveni government. Once they begin to use force on peaceful protesters, that's that downward spiral. And that's what ends dictatorships. And undoubtedly, the Iran dictatorship will be gone very soon because they lost legitimacy when they used violence on their citizens.